And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC basketball podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this next segment, we are going to be talking about the conference semifinals and all of the matchups that ended up happening in that series. So we'll just be talking about my opinions on the teams, how they played, what they did that ended up working, and what they should do in the next season to ultimately get where they want to be and win the championship. So I was talking a little bit about the Nuggets series and how the Timberwolves were able to use their big men to their advantage and sort of slow down Jokic enough for a couple of games and ended up winning the series in the end when they ultimately ended up playing rather poorly towards the end of the series. So like I said before, the matchup between like the Denver Nuggets and the Timberwolves, it was a much better matchup than the Timberwolves needed um when compared to when they were going up against the Dallas Mavericks. Like they had the positions down in this series. And I mean, the Timberwolves, like, their best player is the center, and the Timberwolves, their best defender is the center. So it's like you have a great offensive talent being guarded by a great defensive talent. So that ultimately cancels the two of them out a little bit. Again, only a little bit, because it's all down to how the defender performs and how the offensive player performs, and just when they have a good game and when they have a good game at the right time. And that's sort of like they were able to hold off they were able to hold off the Denver Nuggets just enough to ultimately propel them to win the series in the end. And they ended up blowing them out by a huge margin at home in game six, which was like, it was the big statement game for them, and it ensured them that they were going to game seven, which was very, very important for them. And they also, like, again, it was really down to Jokic playing very, very well. And I'll say, like, Jokic, he got very inconsistent and couldn't close out the rest of the series in the final game. And that ultimately sort of, like, decided the outcome of this series. So, like, really, I feel like the Nuggets, they were, like, the fact that they just lost that game and they lost that series, I think it's more like, the Timberwolves, they just had the better matchups and they were the better team at the right time. Because in game seven, when it's all said, when like literally the entire series is just determined by that one game, the Nuggets, they were up by so much, but then they couldn't close out that final game. And so, really, the biggest issue with Denver is the fact that they just couldn't close out. And the Timberwolves, they just took that to their advantage, and they had the matchups to continue on the series early, and that's ultimately what propelled them to win the series in the end. Just being able to stay alive long enough so that the Nuggets ended up being the downfall of their own success. And that's sort of like, I mean, that was the theme with Game 7, just the fact that Jokic couldn't really score the ball that efficiently, and neither could Jamal Murray after a certain period of time. And that's really where like that's where really where like their problem sort of started, I guess you could say, when they just couldn't close out. And just not being able to close out is a huge, and it's a very important factor in these kinds of series. Now, let's move on to the next series in the Western Conference, which was the Thunder against the Dallas Mavericks. So the Thunder, they went into this series as the number one seed, and the Mavericks, they went into this series as the number five seed. However, the Mavericks also entered the postseason with playoff experience, and I think that was the biggest factor in this entire postseason between between that matchup between the Mavericks and the Thunder. It's just the fact that the Thunder and the rest of the players didn't really have that much experience playing in such a high leverage game. Shai was fantastic in the series, but he was the only real player that was doing anything on that team. And being the youngest team to ever take the one seed, that's obviously a lot of pressure. And expecting them to go far early, like in their careers against a much more experienced team in the postseason, even though they were the one seed, it's not really like something common that happens. So I really think it comes down to just the Thunder's lack of experience and the Mavericks with all of their experience in this series. Like they were able to win 2 games in the series, the Thunder, so that's always good, props to them. But aside from that, it was like I really feel like the Mavericks, they just outdid them in terms of efficiency, and they also outdid them in terms of the experience. And it was just experience and the fact that they only had one star doing majority of the work that ultimately it costed them. So that's the Western Conference, and the reason why I think the Mavericks were able to prevail in that series against the Thunder. So let's move on to the Eastern Conference, where we talk about the teams that matched up in the Eastern Conference semifinals. So between the Celtics and the Cavs, honestly, I've had a feeling from the beginning that the Celtics were going to win the series just because of just how much better they were as a team compared to the Cavs, how much more complete their roster was, and how much more they played with each other compared to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Because most of the time throughout the season, the Cavs, they were fighting injuries. Darius Garland was injured, Donovan Mitchell was injured, and they didn't really play as much games together as they would like to be able to go up against the Celtics. Not to mention the fact that the Celtics have elite perimeter defenders, which were great matchups to be able to counter the offense that the Cleveland Cavaliers were going to sort of try and use on them. And they were able to win 1 game, but that ultimately didn't decide the series. And it was just the fact that the Celtics, they had the better roster, they had the better players, and they had much more experience than that Cavs team. On top of the fact that the Cavs team was also like, it had locker room drama with the coach as well. All of those things played out into this loss, and I don't think they would have ended up winning against the Celtics. So not really much that needs to be talked about in that series. Now let's go on to the Knicks and the Pacers series, which is something that I really, really want to talk about, because that series, I think it came down to injuries. The fact that the Knicks were injured and they were playing with an injured roster compared to when the Pacers, they were playing against a healthy roster. And the fact that the Knicks, they weren't able to hit any kind of shot in Game 7, while the Pacers had a historic Game 7, that was the reason why they ultimately ended up winning the series. And injuries and just a fluky good performance coming in from the Pacers, because I call it fluky because it's never happened in the history of the postseason. Not a single team was able to shoot over 75% in a Game 7 to close out the game. On top of that, the pressure of the Knicks and playing at home, it gets to them. Now, I know it's like, why would they get pressured playing at home? That doesn't make any sense. But as a Knick player, I say this so many times, other players, they circle the Madison Square Garden on their calendar, and they have that game marked as a game that they want to absolutely succeed and perform in. So when you have that kind of mentality of going into a game, it affects the rest of the players, because it's like you're zoned in trying to play very well in Madison Square Garden. You have that calendar day prepped. Every single home game for them is a playoff game, and it's like incredibly exhausting, and it's not something that they can sustain long term. And that's sort of like the big reason as to why I thought on top of the fact that it was just a crazy good performance in Game 7, that was the big reason why I thought the Knicks ended up losing that series. Just the fact that it came down to a Game 7, and none of the players on the Knicks were healthy. I mean, Josh Hart, he was suffering through injuries. OG was also suffering through injuries, and it affected the team, and all these important pieces that they needed on the team to go up against these guys, it wasn't enough. And I feel like that was the big reason as to why the Knicks ultimately ended up losing this series. And I really feel like that if they were healthy, they wouldn't have lost the series. I genuinely believe that, because this Pacers team, it was very, very good against it was good. They were good but only against like the injured teams. And I'll go ahead and explain that a little bit more in depth in the next section, where I'm going to talk about I'll talk about the Eastern Conference and the first round and those matchups and why like I think they lost. But really, the Knicks, all they have to do is make sure that they're healthy, and they could make a legitimate run in the next season. I've said it before, I really think that this Knicks roster, when they're healthy, is enough to be able to beat the Boston Celtics if they capitalize and if they play well in these very, very key and highly important games. So that's really all I have for this third segment. And what are the teams that I talk about? So yeah, with the Thunder, it's the lack of experience. With the Nuggets, it was the fact that they couldn't close out in Game 7. With the Knicks, it was the injuries, and with the Cavs, like they just had a better team. Like the Celtics just had a better team going up against the Cavs. So that's the recap of the semi-conference finals. So now we will go ahead and do a whole playoff recap of the Eastern Conference first round and what is like expected for the rest of the teams. So I will be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.